I was always interested in cinema, so I went to university to study film, and I took 2 years of film production because I wanted to really study the mechanics of making movies. But then after 2 years of film production, I switched into film theory. So I continued and did postgraduate work and got my master's in social and political thought and film theory. Not intending to make films, but intending to write about films. And but when I was in graduate school, I started hanging out downtown with a bunch of, the university was in the suburbs, and I started living downtown and hanging out with punks and alternative artists and whatnot. And a lot of the people that I met were working in Super 8. So I started making Super 8 experimental movies to show in alternative art clubs and art spaces and punk clubs. And I mean, one of the reasons I decided not to pursue filmmaking was because it seemed really technical. Like it's a very complex technical media, and so with Super 8 it was really simple. It's a very, very easy camera to operate, automatic exposure, and just basically flip it on, and it's easy to light. So that was one hurdle to get over, and the other one was that it was prohibitively expensive, and in film school you had to raise the money to make your own films, and I was barely able to pay my tuition. But with Super 8 it was very cheap. So started making these short experimental Super 8 films and fanzines and showing them in punk clubs. And then I got the idea to make a feature-length Super 8 movie. So that's what No Skin Off My Ass became. I was making films, G.B. Jones was making films, and my friend Candy was making film. We were all making films and fanzines. We were sort of like a little collective. And so I appeared in a couple of Candy's films and a couple of G.B. Jones films, and then I think I only made 5, maybe 4 or 5. There was a infamous restaurant in Toronto in the 80s, late 70s and 80s, called Just Desserts, and it was this restaurant that was open till 3 in the morning and 24 hours on weekends, and the owner was a ex-hippie art student who hired only punks and junkies and artists. So it was like the place to work, and that's where I met G.B. Jones. So we would, be there at 4 in the morning, like figuring out our little plans to make films and fanzines, and we made JD's was our homo punk fanzine, because we were really disillusioned with the gay scene and thought it was really bourgeois and stagnant, and so we were drawn to punk because it was much more interesting aesthetically and politically. But then when we really got into it and into the hardcore sort of punk scene in the mid-'80s in Toronto, it was very macho, the mosh pit with the guys with their shirts off. It's very kind of jockish and very homophobic. So we'd show our films in these clubs, and I would get beat up and punched in the nose, and my lesbian friends would form a little human shield around me to protect me from these skinheads and punks. And so we got our revenge by making this very in-your-face, pornographic, gay fanzine that we would send to all the major fanzines and hand out at punk clubs. You would have to call us activists, I suppose, but I'd say we considered ourselves punks before gays. I mean, it was the punk aspect that interested us more, and there was a whole anarcho-punk kind of syndicalist kind of anarcho-syndicalist movement that was very strong in the 80s, and there was like major anarchist conventions that we went to, like in San Francisco, and and there was a huge one in Toronto. So I mean, it was much more organized. I mean, now they have the the G8 summit protests and all that kind of activism, but it really grew out of the 80s punk activism, anarcho-punk activism. I mean, in the 80s, gay activism really got sort of hijacked by AIDS, and so the whole focus was on AIDS and AIDS activism, which was necessary for sure, but it also really took emphasis away from the real, some of the more traditionally important aspects of gay culture, like aesthetics and sort of or gender kind of issues. So those kind of went on the back burner for a long time, and we were always really interested in style and aesthetics as well. And also, a byproduct of AIDS activism was a kind of assimilationist model where, in order to gain legitimacy and kind of lobby like these institutions to get through, legislation that was that would help the cause of this epidemic, there was that was the beginning of sort of the gay movement distancing itself from a lot of its more extreme elements and kind of focusing on the immediate epidemic issues around the epidemic. So that was definitely an aspect of it. I mean, everything was changing then. The early roots of gay, black, and feminist activism from the 70s was extremely militant. It was largely Marxist based, and it was much more involving, more radical kind of civil disobedience and kind of real militancy, even to the point of, if the black movement, like violence, carrying guns and being very almost like an insurrection. So that kind of all started to be toned down in the 80s, I guess, with the rise of the conservative movement. The police became much more militarized, and they were starting to clamp down a lot more on these kind of insurrectionary movements. And in the 90s, by the 90s, I mean, feminism largely disappeared. The gay movement had become extremely assimilationist to the point where it was the roots of lobbying for gay rights and gay marriage and all those kinds of the desire to kind of become part of established institutions instead of like fighting against them. And then the black movement sort of became subsumed by the rise of corporate hip hop and kind of like, which became, hyper capitalist and about as far away as Black Panther Marxism as you can possibly get. Like, it was extremely materialistic and kind of aspirational, and again, it's very much a theme that has run through all my films, which is the oppressed becoming the oppressor. So people who you previously considered the enemy, suddenly you're emulating them and sort of trying to usurp their position rather than fighting against them.